So we look forward to hear from you, Sarah. You have about 20 minutes, and I'll probably give you a hint when you are close to the time. Do you want me to put it on the chat or just speak to you, or what do you prefer?
A chat warning is fine. Thank you, Prof. Yuki.
Okay, great. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, and thank you for such a warm welcome. Good morning, everybody. I hope that most of you are able to join us today despite the load shedding challenges that South Africa is experiencing right now. And I hope the colleagues from other countries are not burdened with the same infrastructural issues. I don't actually have slides today, which is unusual for me. I normally do like to have a visual aid. But as I speak, I hope that the reason for not having slides will become apparent. Now, I've titled my talk to you today, Leading in Times of Techno-Politics, Connecting Through All the Connectivity. And I'd like to open with some of the thoughts that I wrote in the abstract, which is that effective leading and managing of education institutions, professionals, and communities is fundamentally about influencing, establishing legitimacy, and building trust through human relationships. Those of us who are familiar with the ELMA space, Education Leadership Management Administration, know that this is a fundamental component about what leading and managing and administrating in education means. So whether status to make decisions is neither conferred nor demanded. It's something that's an ongoing negotiation between different actors about how we make decisions. And on what terms we make those decisions. So why I'm raising this is because I want to foreground today in my talk that leading and managing is always about power, and power is always political. Given that, then, how do we think? How do we think about this ongoing nuanced negotiation of power, which is in a Foucauldian sense productive, it is dynamic, it is dialogic, and it is never all assuming, it is never totally crushing, it's also emergent. How do we think about that nuanced negotiation in a time of digitally delivered communications and pedagogy? What effects do digital forms of relating with each other have on negotiating leading and following, on negotiating decision-making and responsibility? And how are these invisible conduits that we are using right now in this moment on the Zoom platform, how are they shaping power relations? Because we know that digital relays are far from neutral or inert. So this is what I'd like to talk about today. And I want to just clarify as well that my approach to thinking about education, leadership, and management is from a critical perspective. I'm drawing on scholars like Helen Gunther, Jill Blackmore, Stephen Courtney, Pat Thompson, and others who firmly adhere to the position that we can't divorce education, leadership, and management from the politics or policies within which we work. We can't seek out a contextual or a historical best practice in a technicist sense. There is no one-size-fits-all approaches to education, leadership, and management, what Helen Gunther has called a transnational leadership package, as if it's a product you can pull off the shelf and install. And I like the way Gunther explains in her text, Educational Leadership with Hannah Arendt, that the clear distinctions that we often like to postulate between management, leadership, and administration often arise from a technicist understanding of how we work within administrations and institutions. It's often from an apolitical understanding of education practices. Empirically, the lines between these are very, very hard to draw as to who is the manager, who is the leader, who is the administrator. And it's again about different formats and relations of power. That means necessarily that leading, managing, and administrating education practices and institutions is normative, because we are constantly choosing what we believe to be the best course forward. Of course, what we think is best is the terrain of political struggle and compromise. And doing so democratically involves maximizing, hopefully, the flourishing and well-being of all the people for whom we hold responsibility. I quite like how Gert Biester, the Dutch education philosopher, has recently written in a paper this year that the concept of fulfillment for all and democracy are necessarily the same pursuit. And I like that Prof. Paramel earlier talked about a radical love and a radical hope. Now, that's a different kind of thinking about an emancipatory democracy wherein leadership is pursuing the flourishing of all, rather than a technicist democracy that is about administrating a particular system of thought. But of course, all of this necessarily involves influencing others. Whether we influence by negotiation, debate, charisma, coercion, control, bureaucratic authority, there are many flavors of negotiating and influencing and decision-making. But nonetheless, they all involve that influence in some shape or form and influencing towards what we think is a better course of action. So education, leadership, and management, as I'm sure you're all aware, is always saturated with the political and the ethical, and hence it's always discursive. It's always a terrain about how we make meaning and whose meaning gets to matter. And so if education, leadership, and management is discursive, we need to pay, I would argue, close attention to intended and unintended aims, as well as means. And in particular, I'm curious to think about how aims and means manifest in digitally relayed interaction, how we influence, how we negotiate, how we relate when we interact online. What do we make of the idea of leading and managing through the techno-politics of digitally regulated interaction? As I said, the conduit is far from neutral, but I suggest we haven't given this issue enough thought or interrogation. And perhaps we are assuming how our old ideas around education, management, and leadership are just simply transferring into a new format. I think that's wrong. I think that's a mistake. So the first theorist that I would like to introduce to you today is actually a theorist often used in media studies, Walter Benjamin. And I think he gives us some useful ideas to think with, because he's raising some critical considerations in a particularly famous essay he wrote called The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. Now, in this essay, Walter Benjamin notices that there's a genuineness, a here and nowness. He calls this, for lack of a better word, the aura of a work of art. Now, not aura in a paranormal or sort of supernatural sense, but that sense of genuineness and authenticity. And what Benjamin is saying is that that aura is lost when you view a piece of art through a lens or through a form of technical reproduction, for example, a print. I'll give you a very interesting example. A photo of Van Gogh's Starry Night, a very famous painting. We could all right now pull a photo of that painting up on Google, on the smart devices we walk around with in our pockets. But it does not compare to standing before that painting in the Metropolitan Museum, entranced by it. The two experiences are very different. Benjamin is asking us to notice this, that we are all very excited and incredibly much more able to access an image of Starry Night with the devices in our pockets and the search engines we've built in this era of unprecedented connectivity. But it does not enable us to connect with the painting as we do when we're in its presence. Many people have noticed this in the COVID-19 world. The comment normally goes along the lines of, well, it's just not the same seeing you on Zoom as it is seeing you in real life. How nice it is to meet people for a coffee instead of talking through a screen. That's what Benjamin is getting at. Something intangible, but very much undeniable, is different between the two experiences. And we can have debates about better or worse normatively, but Benjamin is asking us to notice the difference. So how do we think about leading education institutions in the absence of what Benjamin calls this aura? And what role does that play in how we influence each other in decision-making in our education practices? How do we connect through the connectivity? How do we influence and persuade each other in democratic ways, rather than in the commodified logic of influences? Now, Benjamin offers us another very productive example. In the essay, he compares the difference between live theatre acting with an audience to screen acting. He says the screen actor does not engage in the emergent responsive dialogue with their audience, but performs to this inert machine, the lens of the camera. In doing so, they hope that their performance is satisfactory to an absent, distant audience who experiences no interaction with the stage, which is somehow, to be honest, is somehow what I'm feeling like right now as I perform to my laptop. Another contemporary example is if anyone watches sport, watching the empty cricket stadia, watching the empty football stadia where the players perform before empty stands, but the loudspeakers are piping over the noise, simulating a crowd when a goal is scored or a boundary is struck. It's actually quite surreal. There is something sensorially jarring about noticing that is not the same experience. Right now, that's exactly what's happening as I speak to you. I can't see most of you. At best, I get a grid of blank Zoom squares that confront me as I'm looking at my screen. And that's if I'm not hiding behind my own slides to level the playing field so that I can hide from your gaze as much as you can hide from mine. And that's why I didn't use slides today, is to make that point. With respect to Prof. Hallinger's point yesterday, I think we need to be wary about whether online format is necessarily better because it increases our numbers. Because while there is more of us because of the technology, I don't think we can assume normatively that's always a better engagement as a result. Benjamin wrote quite presciently, in this age of technological reproduction, quantity is now quality. And I think we can all appreciate that collapsing the concept of quality into the concept of quantity is a very problematic collapse. If we were in the same room right now, I could read the room. I could feel the mood and the energy. We would enter in some kind of a compact, some kind of a mutual understanding about the presence that we have come together in order to engage in an activity together. You might feel a bit more ashamed to get up in the middle of my talk and go get a coffee. You might even avoid glancing at your email or your phone if you were in the front row before me. I would try my best to engage you using eye contact, to gesticulate. We certainly could converse more. And while we might feel some relief at the absence of this tractor beam that being co-present creates, because it gives us some freedom from constraint, it's also distracting. And Benjamin sets this up for us because he contrasts immersion with distraction. He's arguing that the technologically mediated engagement not only dispenses with aura, but with it immersion. And that immersion is replaced with a type of distraction. I'm not for a moment arguing that Benjamin offers us everything we need to think about education and management leadership in these times of heightened technological connectivity. Not at all, that's not what I'm saying. Rather, I think he's asking us to notice that these moments of rapid transition are not just about form. We're not just doing the same thing, but in a new format. He's telling us that they also signal a change in the very substance of our interaction. And I think at the very least, we need to be alive and awake to that change, and we need to pay to it due scholarly curiosity and attention. Now, Bista, who I mentioned earlier, wrote a really compelling piece of work in 2004 about a similar type of change at the neoliberal turn in an earlier moment. And in that 2004 paper, he looks to the difference between accountability and responsibility for education leaders and managers. And he argues that the shift from responsibility in a democratic sense to accountability in a more audit sense brought anti-democratic tendencies. In summary, he makes a compelling argument using some philosophical, very clever work that not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. There are some things that defy the quantifiable, but they are very important for human flourishing, interaction, democracy, and care. And the critical ethical aspect of education, leadership, and management, Bista argues, can't be captured. It can't be codified in rules and regulations, audit, or ledgers. So I think that similarly, we need to be noticing that not everything about democratic leading, including establishing legitimacy, the bequeathing of authority, particularly if we're thinking about education leadership beyond position, we're thinking about beyond headship or bureaucratic hierarchy, can be contained in these forms of communicating we're using technologically and digitally. There's something about what Benjamin calls an aura that is lost in a relay of pure audiovisual data. A manager or leader's capacity to elicit trust, convey care, negotiate tension, notice silences and exclusions, detect and convey body language and tone is all truncated and curtailed in a digital format. The positives that do arise are primarily of a technicist nature. Record keeping, just hit the record button or download the chat. Attendance registers, well, you can see who entered the Zoom room. Surveillance capacities, and of course, the rather undemocratic power to mute. So I think there's something interesting to notice that digitally related communications could potentially further entrench technicist accountability approaches to ALMA at the expense of humanizing and democratic approaches. And Benjamin's work alerts us to the idea that the change that Bista described is becoming more entrenched and sedimented, but also that new changes are afoot that we need to interrogate with a critical view. So I'd like to leave you with the following ideas. And this is just a short talk to invite you to begin to think about what we need to do as we move forward. In summary, my three main points are, firstly, interacting online is not just old practices in a new medium. It is fundamentally changing the way we interact socially, and that has implications for social relations, power, and justice. Secondly, we should not mistake connectivity with connecting. To do so would be to replace an act that is fundamental to democracy and human flourishing with a technocratic metric. And thirdly, leading and managing education towards democratic practices with a radical social justice imperative is going to be entangled in all of this. And that I think this entanglement needs careful, critical, conceptual, and empirical work. I've deliberately kept things to a shorter session, so that is what I have to share with you today. Back to you, Prof. Yuki.